People ask me all the time, what's your trick to learn English? How do I sound more native? How do I stop forgetting vocabulary? What should I watch? What's the fastest way to improve? And they usually expect some revolutionary method or secret shortcut. But most of the things that actually help me learn languages are surprisingly simple. It's mostly being curious, writing things down, reusing vocabulary, and accepting that you're never going to know everything, which in a weird way makes learning much less stressful. Because one thing I've noticed after years learning and teaching languages is that the people who improve the most are usually not the people obsessing over fluency. They are the people who build systems that help them stay connected to the language consistently. And over time, I realized I kind of built a lot of those systems for myself. So today, I wanted to talk about some of the things I do in real life. Not 10 hacks to sound native, just the way I actually work with language every day. Something happened in class today that reminded me how important this is. One of my students said, I don't know where I wrote the notes from last class because I have the university notes, work notes, English notes, everything mixed together in this notebook. And I was thinking I could never do that because one of the biggest things that helps me retain information is separating contexts. I have different notebooks for different things. Let me show you. These are my three favorite notebooks. But for example, I have one notebook specifically for technical vocabulary related to companies and industries I work with. It's completely black. Because sometimes I teach fields I didn't originally know much about. For example, the latest one is about transformers, cable windings, laboratory testing, voltage systems, manufacturing processes, which I know nothing. Very specific vocabulary. And instead of trying to force myself to remember everything naturally, which is impossible, well, would it land? I have no previous knowledge about this. I prefer to document it. Because language learning becomes much easier when your brain knows where information lives. And this is important because professional English is not just grammar. If you work internationally, your English becomes connected to your field. Your meetings, your products, your clients, your technical word. So that vocabulary matters. I also have another notebook that's divided into three sections: Italian, English, and German. This notebook is more about curiosity. It has notes from a German summer course I took, Italian vocabulary, English expressions I hear in podcasts, phrases from books, pronunciation notes, random observations, things I find interesting enough to keep. And one thing I've learned about myself is if I don't write something down, my brain deletes it immediately. I think it happens the same to you, especially if the topic has nothing to do with my life. For example, I'm a vegetarian. So every single time students ask me about cuts of meat during barbecues or cooking conversations, I forgot the vocabulary instantly. Sorry. Every single time. Because I never used those words personally. At some point, I got tired of relearning the same vocabulary over and over again, so I started writing it down. Problem solved. I have a whole chart with meat cuts. And I think people underestimate how normal this is. Teachers forget vocabulary too. People who work with languages all day still learn expressions constantly. Native speakers also hear phrases they've never heard before. That process never ends. And one thing I do constantly, both for myself and with students, is that I never just memorize isolated words. If I find a phrase interesting, I usually search for synonyms, look up the definition, find examples, and create questions using that vocabulary. Because vocabulary becomes useful once you interact with it repeatedly. That's also exactly how I work with students in class. If we learn a new word, I usually give the definition, examples, questions using the expression, and then I ask the students to use it themselves, because otherwise vocabulary stays passive. For example, this weekend I learned the British expression hair of the dog. The British person pronounced it as hair dog, which strange to hear it in this podcast. Stay with me. Which basically means drinking alcohol the next day to help with a hangover when you drink too much alcohol. And I learned it while traveling because I heard someone say it naturally in a conversation. At first, I didn't fully catch it, so I wrote the pronunciation down using IPA for phonology, the pronunciation I heard, and I gave it to AI. Like, I heard this from a British person. What does it mean in this context? Later, I searched the meaning, the origin, examples, and how people actually use it naturally. That entire process helps the phrase stick much more than simply translating it once. And I do this constantly with podcasts too. I listen to a lot of content about communication, business presence, leadership, psychology, and when I hear a phrase I love, I immediately write it down in this notebook. I write down the timestamp, a few words from the sentence, and then I continue listening. Later, I go back, copy the transcript into AI tools, extract the phrases I marked, and work with them properly. If I find them appropriate, suitable for a lesson, I may reuse them in those cases. So by teaching them, I also keep learning. I extract the phrases and work with them properly with the definitions, the examples, the questions, the synonyms. I reuse them. Another thing that's helped me massively, both in English and Italian, has been creating personalized audio content for myself. How, you may ask? Because one thing I know about myself is that I'm extremely hyperactive mentally. If something doesn't keep my attention, I disconnect immediately. And this became very obvious while studying for one of my university courses during my degree. I had tons of material to review, and sitting down to reread everything quietly was not working for me at all. So I gathered the material, organized the ideas I needed, and uploaded everything into Notebook LM to generate podcast style conversations. And suddenly, the content became much easier to process because I could listen while walking, cleaning, organizing things instead of forcing myself to stare at a document for hours. That changed a lot for me. And then I started doing something similar with Italian because of one frustration I had was that people constantly recommended just listen to Italian podcasts. But the problem was I wasn't interested in the topics. The variety in Italian is not as rich as the one in English. A lot of beginner content focused on Italian culture, tourism, basic conversations. And while that's useful, I personally wanted to hear discussions about communication, psychology, business presence, leadership. The same things I already enjoy in English. So instead of forcing myself to consume content I didn't care about, I built my own. I collected English podcast episodes I genuinely liked, extracted phrases and ideas I wanted to learn, created prompts for Notebook LM, and generated podcast style conversations in Italian around topics that actually interested me. An English teacher on a normal day. Sometimes I even asked it to include specific vocabulary or expressions I wanted to practice, discussion questions, or moments where the host challenged me with questions so I could answer out loud. And I think this matters because people often assume language learning has to look a certain way. But sometimes the smartest thing you can do is adapt the process to the way your brain naturally works. Because the more emotionally engaged you are with the content, the easier it becomes to stay consistent. There are certain expressions I hear constantly in professional environments that I love because they sound natural without sounding forced. For example, one that I worked with today in a video related to AI. It was on the chopping block. This means something is at risk of being eliminated, cut, or removed. For example, with the new budget cuts, several projects are on the chopping block. It can be useful with some North Americans that they tend to have a semi-informal style. Another one I love is hotshot. Some of my students have been working with this video this week. This can describe someone extremely talented, successful, or confident, sometimes with admiration and sometimes a little sarcastically, depending on the tone. For example, he's one of the hotshots in the company now. Another expression I hear in meetings is put out fires, which means dealing with urgent problems constantly. For example, I spent the whole week putting out fires instead of focusing on strategy. And this is also why I think learning through real context matters so much more than random vocabulary lists. Because expressions become memorable once they connect to situations, people, stories, emotions, or experiences. This opinion sometimes surprises people, but personally, I don't really recommend watching series specifically to study English. Of course, exposure helps. But if I'm watching something to relax, I want to actually relax. The moment I start pausing every sentence, writing vocabulary, role playing scenes, and analyzing grammar, it stops being rest. So for me, learning mode and resting mode are different things. If I want to study English intentionally, I'd rather do it with content connected to things I genuinely care about. That's why podcasts work so well for me because I'm already interested in communication, business presence, leadership, psychology, and the language becomes attached to ideas I already want to explore. And I think that changes everything. So, no, I don't really have magical language hacks. Most of what helped me improve over the years came from curiosity, repetition, organization, and interaction. I document things, I reuse vocabulary, I connect language to real interest, I let myself learn slowly. I actually have a lot of post-its in front of me. And I stopped expecting myself to know everything all the time because nobody does. And I think the moment language stops feeling like a performance and starts becoming part of your actual life, learning becomes much more sustainable. So now I'm curious. What's something that generally helps you remember English better? Because I'm always stealing new ideas too. So let me know.